Today's presentation is on behalf of U.S. Ukraine's Foundation's Ukraine 2020 program. And we are very fortunate to have with us today Professor Snyder. Professor Snyder teaches history at Yale. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford and has held fellowships in Paris, Vienna, and at Harvard. He's the author of numerous scholarly books and articles. Some of his books include The Red Prince, The Secret of Habsburg Archduke, Sketches from a Secret War, a Polish artist's mission to liberate Soviet Ukraine, The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, 1569-1999. Nationalism, Marxism, and Modern Central Europe, a biography of Kazimierz Keles-Krauss, 1872-1905, and The Economic Crisis of Perestroika, which was published in 1991.
Very long time ago. Yes.
Yes. Well, he has also written and not. Oh, I'm sorry. Shall we continue? He is also, as I said, an author of a great many scholarly articles, reviews, and so on. His latest book, and the subject of today's talk, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, traces the history of the mass killings in Eastern Europe and part of Central Europe by Hitler and Stalin. As Anne Applebaum states in her review, I think the review was published, I believe, November 11 in the New York Review Books, yes. Professor Snyder, in his latest work, reminds the West that from the early 30s to the end of World War II, the area that comprised Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states was the region that experienced the worst of both Stalin's and Hitler's ideological madness, end of quote. And again, I'm not going to continue with introduction because it would take too long a time to properly introduce Professor Snyder, and we don't have much time. So let me at this point, again, welcome Professor Snyder on behalf of U.S. Ukraine Foundation and all of us present here today. Professor Snyder.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks to the U.S. Ukraine Foundation for the invitation. What I'd like to do is take half an hour or so and talk to you about what this book is about, what it seeks to do, how I tried to write a kind of complete history of both German and Soviet mass killing. This is and this isn't a book about Ukraine. It's a book about an observation, really. The observation is that of the 17 million people, non-combatants, civilians, killed by the Germans and the Soviets, about 14 million of them died in a relatively small place in over a relatively short period of time. That place is what I call the Bloodlands, the territories between the Baltic and the Black Seas, between Berlin and Moscow, more or less comprising today's Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the western rim of Russia. The time is 1933 to 1945, the period when both Hitler and Stalin were in power. So this is a book about Ukraine in the sense that of those 14 million, roughly half die in Ukraine. But it's also not about a book about Ukraine in the sense that I try to understand the tragedies that Ukraine encountered within this larger framework of a contest between two regimes for lands in between. Let me try to answer three questions. Why did I write this? How did I do it? And what does it teach us? I tried to write it because there is no such book. if you stop and think about it. There are many important books about elements of this. There is a strong literature about the Holocaust. There is an emerging literature about the Holodomor. There are some very good books about Stalinist terror and so on. But there is no book which actually discusses the killing policies of both regimes in any kind of systematic way. I also noticed that there were opportunities in the historical literature as it exists, precisely because we have strong or ever stronger national literatures about Polish tragedies or Ukrainian tragedies or Belarusian tragedies even. That provides a kind of basis for further study. But that also generates a problem to be overcome, because history is usually understood in national terms, and to a large extent that's understandable. But in my view, we have to get beyond that if we're going to see the totality of the suffering. Something similar should be said about what we've learned in Soviet history. We've learned a huge amount in the last 20 years. Colleagues from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, the U.S., and elsewhere have used archival access to give us a much clearer picture of what happened in collectivization, the famine in Ukraine, the terror. But what we need to do is to integrate those findings into a history of the region that suffered most, and that's what I tried to do in this book. Another very strong literature is the Holocaust literature. That is by far the most sophisticated historical literature that treats this period, but it too has some limitations. One of them is that Holocaust history is written almost exclusively on the basis of German sources. And this can take you very far if what you're trying to do is understand the regime and its decisions. But on the basis of the German language, you can't really recreate the societies, not only Jewish, but Polish, Ukrainian, and other, among whom Jews lived. You can't create things, you can't recreate the history from the point of view of the victims, because most of the victims of the Holocaust, not to speak of other policies, didn't speak German. Only 3% of the victims of the Holocaust spoke German. So that's one limitation. And another is that the Holocaust literature tends not to ask about the relationship between German killing policies, between starvation of Soviet prisoners of war and the Holocaust, for example. And it usually also leaves out the East European background in a more general way. So when it's not asked what it might mean that the Soviets and the Germans were allies in 1939, for example. So we have this opportunity. The opportunity is that archives have been open, very important new books have been written, and what I sought to do was to bring all of this together and to make sense, if that's the right way to put things, of the killing policies in which left 14 million people dead. How did I do this? I tried to observe some really conservative rules of history which are often observed in the breach. One of them is to understand and to maintain, to insist, that history consists in everything that happened, that there aren't events that are beyond history. If things are very important, that's precisely why we have to research them historically. So it's illegitimate, in my view, to say that something like the Holocaust, because it was so tragic, is therefore outside of history. We precisely for that reason have to try to understand it. The same goes in a different way for Stalin's crimes. One still runs across people, including historian colleagues, who maintain that there was a point to collectivization, or there was a point to terror, because it preserved the Soviet regime, it modernized the Soviet regime, it allowed the Soviet regime to win the Second World War. I think it's very important to focus on the events themselves. If the famine in Ukraine killed 3.3 million people, we ought to try to understand the famine in Ukraine as such, as a distinct event, and not say that it only can be understood in terms of what it supposedly achieved. By the way, I don't happen to think that collectivization and terror helped the Soviets win the Second World War. That's another question. What I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to understand these events on their own terms, in their time and place, rather than as in their relationship to other things that might have happened later, which is another very simple part of the method. I'm looking at a time and I'm looking at a place. Again, this is very simple historical method. Looking at the time and the place allows me to do a couple of things. The first is I can see how a series of killing policies appears and affected the peoples of these lands, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, Jews, and others. I can begin with the famine in Ukraine and then move through other policies, terror, cooperation between the Soviets and the Germans, and so on, all of which took place over this short period of time in this one place. The other thing that concentrating on territory allows me to do is to keep both the Nazi and the Soviet regimes in view. without constantly comparing them. In general, what happens as soon as you start talking about these territories and these policies is people say, oh, you're comparing the Soviets and the Germans. And I do at the very end of the book. But that's not really my chief concern. My chief concern is to understand what happened first. I think we've done an awful lot of comparing without knowing a lot of what we needed to know. And now we're in a position to know what we need to know to make these comparisons. But my point is that using territory, I can bring the Germans in and the Soviets in without constantly talking about Berlin and Moscow, without being too abstract. Because the book is focused on what's now Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Western Russia, the Baltics, you see this Soviet power apply itself, and then you see German power apply itself, and then you see the Soviets return. And so the two regimes are always present. They're always palpable. They're not distant. They're not abstract. They don't exist only in offices in Berlin or in Moscow. Another important distinction that I make, and it's going to sound simple, I'm afraid, is that I distinguish in this book between deliberate killing and concentration camps. Also ethnic cleansing. These are things which get very blurry in the historical literature. But I think it's important to distinguish between policies which are aimed to kill people, either by starvation or by shooting or by gas, whatever it might be, and policies which punish them in a horrible way and often lead to their deaths. The Soviets and the Germans, each of them, killed more people deliberately than they killed by way of concentration camps. We generally talk about concentration camps as being the center of the horror of both the German and the Soviet regimes, but sadly they're not. Sadly, they're only the outer edge. There are much worse things, and the much worse things are my subject here. So I do discuss concentration camps, and I do discuss ethnic cleansing, but the subject of this book are policies which were deliberately designed to kill human beings. Another thing which, another historical method which I try to observe here is what I call, and forgive me if this sounds a little pompous, but what I call plural causality. The idea that an important event must have more than one cause, and that it's always going to be reductionist and misleading to try to bring things back to a single cause. One example of this is national history, right? Now let us imagine, and I'm sure this is true of most of you in this room, that you know a lot about Ukrainian history. Even if you knew everything about Ukrainian history, which I'm not going to demand of you, but even if you knew everything about Ukrainian history, that would not allow you to understand the famine of 1932 and 1933. The famine is an event in Ukrainian history, but you can't use previous Ukrainian history to explain it. To explain it, you have to understand the Soviet Union. You have to understand something else, something larger. And this is true of all other tragedies. It's true of the Holocaust in the same way. You could know everything about Jewish history, but that wouldn't allow you to understand why the Germans started exterminating whole communities of Jews in 1941. You could know everything about Polish history, but this wouldn't allow you to understand why 110,000 ethnic Poles in the Soviet Union were shot in 1937 and 1938 as supposed spies. Those are events that are in the history, but to understand them, you have to go beyond. You have to look for factors which are beyond the nation. And so what I do ends up, I think, changing national history, but my point here is that you have to go beyond national history to explain events in national history. Another thing I mean by avoiding over-simple explanations is that I think you have to understand the Germans and the Soviets together. Now this is of course very delicate, and I can't go into how I try to do it in the book. It's different at different points in time. But it's very hard to understand what the Germans are up to if you don't remember that the Soviet Union is there, because a key element of what Nazi ideology consisted in was always the aspiration of destroying Soviet power and taking over the Western Soviet Union. Likewise, Stalin, from the moment where he established popular fronts onward, from 1934 forwards, always has his eye on Germany. He doesn't always understand Germany correctly. He gets things wrong a lot of the time. He doesn't believe that the Germans are going to invade in 1941. But Germany is always a factor. And so you can't, we do write about Germany without the Soviet Union, and we do write about the Soviet Union without Germany. That's in fact how we generally do it. What I'd like to maintain is that to really understand what happened, especially to the peoples in between, you have to keep them both in view at the same time.